The North Atlantic War by Michael Trela. Operation Counterstrike. Stage 1. Second Battle of Kulisuk. The room was dimly lit by a single desk lamp as Horace Ironside paced about, following a zigzag pattern from one side of the room to the other, and then repeating the same pattern inversely. The Republic's forward command center was built into the side of one of the mountains that dominated the nation's southeast coast, close to the front lines, yet far enough away as to not be an immediate threat by the invasion force. The only enemy units that had the chance to discover their location were the reconnaissance aircraft of the Royal Air Force. That chance was long gone now. Colonel Halliburtt's Black Falcons had ensured that. Yet despite the considerable distance between the base and Kulisuk, Ironside could hear the entire bombardment from the Royal Navy's fleet, and had listened attentively to the concussions of offshore artillery firing and the explosions of shells making contact with solid ground. Though the city was beyond sight, he could only assume that hardly anything remained of it. The loss of so many industrial plants was a blow indeed. Still, the sacrifice was a necessary one for the plan to go as intended. Necessary sacrifice, the general repeated in his mind. God, how I hate the term. He couldn't help but cringe at the concept. Thousands of people's homes destroyed, the Republic's industrial strength lessened, and 300 soldiers left poorly armed against a modernized expeditionary force a necessary sacrifice? He stopped behind his desk and pulled open the top drawer on the far right and took out the pocket Bible he kept in it. At least you've always got a word or two to keep me calm, eh, God? Before he had opened the book, the office's phone began to ring, shattering the day-long silence that had enveloped the room since the bombardment had ceased. "This is Ironside," he said as he answered it. "Good news, Horace. We just received word from Captain Cyprian. The British have taken Kulisuk." Ironside immediately recognized the voice as Patton's. "Excellent. Make sure to commend Cornelius and his men for their actions." "Oh, they'll be getting plenty for their heroics, I assure you," Patton replied with a snicker. "Is it go time?" "Affirmative, George. Commence Operation Counterstrike." He hung up the phone and made his way to the door. As he opened it, he took one last glance at his pocket Bible, which he had left out on the desk. "You always do come through for me," he chuckled. The sky was overcast again. Or was it the remainder of the smoke rising up from the aftermath of the battle that was blocking out the sun? Ruckinson couldn't tell. His forces had set up patrols to the east of the city, while the majority of the troops rested for the day. The fight had been a brutal one. Men on foot charging up a hill, atop which a defiant entrenched enemy were cutting them down in a hail of bullets, while armor and support straggled up the debris as it fought to keep pace with the infantry. It was a perfectly horrible battle scenario. It couldn't have gone more in the enemy's favor. He remembered the old war documentaries he had watched during his officer training. If he had learned anything from them, it was that charging uphill against a prepared foe meant blood. A lot of blood. He couldn't shake the thought. The battle had gone extremely well for the defenders. Too well. It was almost as if they had orchestrated it. But that would have been impossible, would it not? For a primitive island nation to have planned out the response to the assault was inconceivable. Wasn't it? A soldier stepped into the ruined warehouse which the colonel had been using as a command tent, interrupting his brooding. "Sir, the scout reports are in." "Well then," Ruckinson replied, "what have they got to say?" The soldier was no rookie, but the way concern and uncertainty flashed behind his eyes sure made him seem like one. It was unsettling. "Patrol Team Alpha reports that they have discovered the wreckage of a fighter jet. It's a Eurofighter class, Typhoon 6. "One of ours?" the colonel asked rhetorically. Now he saw why the man was so subtly fidgety. It's as if they had orchestrated the battle. The thought came back with the force of a hurricane, nearly clouding his mind to the point of speechlessness. "What about the others?" he finally managed to spit out. "Teams Bravo and Charlie report no signs of irregularity." He paused, a faint shadow of foreboding falling over his face. "Team Delta has not returned. After they reported a subtle movement in the brush and went to investigate, we lost all communication with them." The shock of the truth hit Ruckinson like a sledgehammer to the gut. The submarines out in the Atlantic, the evacuated city, the well-armed defenders, the lack of air support, their sudden disappearance, the note. It all made sense. Perfect, solid, terrifying sense. "We're all going to die," he whispered to himself. "Sir?" The other soldier was still standing in the wrecked doorway, his face beading with sweat as he did his utmost to remain calm and collected. The colonel gave him a cold look. "Take defensive positions. Spread word throughout the camp. All forces on high alert for incoming enemy forces." The man hesitated. "Sir, the patrols didn't make mention of incoming enemies." Ruckinson's troubled expression instantly changed to one of annoyed authority. "Just do it, curse you!" he near yelled. "If you and anyone else in this godforsaken expeditionary force wish to preserve your lives for another day, then you'll prepare for the upcoming battle. Go, soldier! Now!" The man straightened up. "Yes, sir!" The next instant he was gone, sounding the call to entrench. Outside the ruin, the colonel could hear the sounds of men shouting and vehicles moving. Stepping out into the cool noon air, he looked out at the western horizon, jagged hills skewing the gray sky. Behind them were the enemy, watching, waiting, smiling. "Lord knows what else they have planned for us," he thought. The red and white of the Republic's flag was painted proudly upon the gun's hull, as the self-propelled gun thundered its way through the bustling crowd of soldiers. The place was alive with movement and orders, as the Republic Army made ready to mobilize. The artillery guns were being lined up in bombardment formation, their massive cannons trained on a target several miles to the east. That target was Kulisuk. Half the distance between the guns and the city were 3 divisions, ready to move in at a moment's notice. Once the SPGs had softened up the enemy forces, they would close in for the kill, followed up by the troops stationed directly ahead of the artillery pieces. In a temporary bunker surrounded by supply crates and flanked by 2 T-92 main battle tanks, stood General Trela, reviewing a map of the land surrounding the ruined city. Markers signifying the locations of their troops and the predicted positions of the enemy dotted its surface, while thick lines snaked between the two, several courses of action having been considered and scribbled down with a large pencil. The route which was decided upon as best was highlighted in bright red. Trela picked up his field radio headset. "Put me through to Colonel Halberd," he said to the operator standing next to the machine. He waited for the telltale click in his inner ear before he spoke into the microphone. "Halberd, Counterstrike is underway. Have your squad ready for liftoff." "Roger that, General. The Black Falcons are making ready to take to the skies once again." The men on the guns were still and silent. The heavy caliber cannons were loaded, aimed, and ready to fire. All they needed now was the order. Theirs was the task of disorienting the enemy and forcing them out of position so that the forward troops could close in. They were the ones privileged with the opportunity to exact the first blows of retribution against their attackers, to avenge the destruction of the city many of them had called home. They were the speartip of the Republic's vengeance. They were ready. The red lights glowing from above the targeting cursors flickered out, replaced by a blinking green. That was it. The call erupted from the gunnery sergeants all at once. "Fire!" Sounds similar to those of a distant thunderstorm rose and filled the atmosphere, the booms of heavy artillery resonating and echoing off the bare rock that formed the jagged hills forming the landscape. To most, it was a sound of impending doom, a noise to be feared and hated as the beating drums which signaled the approach of hell. To General Patton, it was a symphony. The firing guns were a thrumming bass, the whistling of projectiles as they passed overhead rising and falling in perfect crescendo and decrescendo, and the final crash of the warheads hitting home like a clash of cymbals to finish off the masterpiece. No modern style of music that the younger generations were coming up with and listening to could match the orchestratic beauty that filled his ears. Nay, it elated him so that he nigh compared it to the works of the geniuses of the classical era of music. It took him a little while to recollect himself from his reverie. He didn't love war per se, for in itself mass bloodshed was immoral and a version of hell on earth. However, he couldn't help but acknowledge the thrill of battle and music of gunfire as they strengthened men's resolve and drove them to new heights of courage and feats of heroism. As he looked about the craggy hills among which his vanguard were spread, a new sound filled his ears, the rushing of wind and the screeching of air as it was torn asunder by steel-winged jets, occasionally punctured by the resound of a sonic boom, sound itself unable to keep pace with the aircraft of the Republic Air Corps. Even as they zoomed high above them, Patton knew that the black-painted P-150 fighter jets would not be needed so much for their combat as for intimidation. Dozens, possibly hundreds more followed. Bombers, fighters, ground assault craft, and even a couple spy planes. Virtually every class of jet in the Republic's Air Corps were in the Armada, and they weren't alone. The pulsing of blades beating against the cold, dry air could be felt deep within his chest as Patton watched the lower flying choppers soar past. Once again, not a single variation was left out. Even transport gunships could be seen mixed in among the rest, no doubt laden with explosive ordnance as well as troops. The general then looked around at his own forces, arrayed in a perfect attack formation. Soldiers ranging from basic ground infantry to heavy weapons, snipers to demolition experts, were present. Infantry fighting vehicles equipped with reinforced armor and armed with rotary machine guns dotted the infantry at regular intervals. But these weren't what impressed him most. It was the tanks. More numerous than any other vehicle present, each one capable of holding a city cross-section on its own, the tanks of the Republic Armored Corps were truly a force to be reckoned with. T-92B NBTs were the most numerous, as exemplary a model of an NBT as could be found on the planet, with thick, sloped, and spaced armor to provide protection against most anti-vehicle weaponry. The frontal glacis plate and commander's hatch particularly reinforced. Capable of reading speeds of up to 60 miles per hour on smooth terrain, it combined German, American, and Russian armor design. Several other tank types are present as well, such as the T-40S light tanks, capable of reaching 86 miles per hour on smooth ground, and the T-115F9 demolishers, slower than the others, but capable of reducing even the toughest fortifications to rubble in minutes with their 155mm guns. They also made good mobile combat platforms with their thicker armor and machine gun ports. However, one stood out from all the others. A tank the likes of which had only been conceived as far-fetched notions that could only exist in virtual reality. The M750 Mammoth tank was its design, and no other military vehicle could better embody the name. Sporting twin 130mm cannons, 6 machine gun ports, a turret-mounted grenade launcher, and dual surface-to-air missile launch bays, the single Mammoth present for the assault was the pride of the Republic Army, and Patton's personal command tank. Though large and slow compared to the other military vehicles, its massively thick, spaced armor could withstand a Gatling gun's merciless sweep with no injury to its crew or modules. The general patted the machine's armored turret and smiled. "Well, big girl, it's time to show those British punks what you're made of." With that said, he reached down to the holster at his belt and drew out a flare gun, aiming directly above him. "For the Republic!" he shouted. "For the Republic!" the crowd echoed back from all around him. He pulled the trigger. Thus the full military might of the North Atlantic Republic would be revealed. Thus the Second Battle of Kulusuk was begun. The soldiers pulled their helmets down over their faces to block out the smoke and dust that was thrown up by the explosions. The Union Jack fluttered madly atop the redoubt that had been used as the command bunker as the blast from the bombs whipped it in all directions at once. A group of them huddled together in the shadow of a ruined hotel, the one in the middle crying shrieks through his dirt-covered face. "On your feet, men!" shouted their corporal, coming over to where they were crouched. "Stop crying like bloody sissies and take up defensive positions!" Though he screamed at them at the top of his lungs, the men couldn't hear him, too caught up in their grief and despair to pay him any attention. "Damn this accursed island! I didn't sign up for this," one of them said. We shouldn't be here. I thought we were quelling a rebellion of primitives, not being sent to our bloody deaths. Get a grip of yourself, soldier, the corporal shouted, coming closer to them. If you don't get your... He was cut off as an artillery shell crashed into the ground right behind him, tearing his body to shreds and sending the pieces into the faces of those cowering behind the wall. They screamed in terror as they frantically pulled the officer's intestines off themselves, the one in the middle staring aghast as the dead man's head rolled to his feet. We're in hell! He shouted at his wits' end. Oh God, what did I do to deserve this? As he uttered these words, the wall under whose shadow they were taking refuge shook and swayed, as yet another shell impacted at its base. The men looked up in horror as massive chunks of brick, cement, and steel came crashing down upon them. They managed to let out one last cry of despair as they were buried beneath tons of rubble. Ruckinson could feel a chill down his spine at the sight. 4 grown men reduced to whimpering cowards in an instant. The cruelty of it all. The soldiers cowering, the corporal blown to bits as he tried to rally them, their shelter crashing down upon them as though putting them out of their misery. It was maddening. Their whole situation was maddening. The entire operation was madness. Damnation! Where are those confounded reinforcements? He roared. A tower of flame suddenly erupted from the redoubt upon which the Union Jack was perched, as the dormant gas burner was struck by the blast of an artillery shell. As the building burned and crumpled, the colonel's eyes were transfixed upon the flag, wreathed in flames. He couldn't look away from the heart-rending sight, as the very symbol of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, a global superpower, was devoured by the fires of a battle that should never have taken place. Finally, the structure beneath it collapsed. The Union Jack fell. Tears welled up in Ruckinson's eyes, realizing how symbolic the event was. He slumped to his knees, his strength having been drained from his legs by this omen of doom. Hands grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him violently, snapping him out of the shock of the last few seconds before the force of the man's arms would have snapped his neck. He looked up to find an ash-smitten soldier looking intently at him. He was saying something, but the words seemed distant and slurred. It took the colonel another 20 seconds or so to finally make out what he was saying. Colonel! Colonel! Can you hear me? Are you all right? Colonel! Ruckinson stood up suddenly and forcefully, grabbing the soldier by his combat armor and throwing him off as strength returned to him, along with his usual gruffness. I'm fine, man, he replied. What are you doing out in the open like this? The soldier, a captain by the look of his badge of rank, looked at him confused. The colonel then realized that he himself was just standing out in the open as well. Despite this, the captain continued. Sir, the shelling has stopped. We await your orders. Ruckinson nearly reeled as he finally noticed the lack of noise, the silence almost deafening with its oblivion. Well, I'll be darned, he muttered. Then they flinched as the silence, which they were just about adjusted to, was shattered once more. Not by an explosion, however, though it resembled one in the way it resounded in their rib cages. Another soon followed, and then another. That was when they realized that the booms were coming from directly above them. As they turned their eyes skyward, the 2 soldiers stood aghast at what they beheld. A group of fighters soared high above them, their pitch-black hulls a stark contrast to the light gray sky of the overcast sky. The jets flew in perfect formation, a skull and crossbones. The message couldn't have been clearer. The British troops were quick to recover from the shock of the sight, however, and soon anti-aircraft guns and SAMs were ready to fire. Even as they took aim, though, the jets suddenly dispersed, picking up speed at an incredible rate. Then they were joined by more jets, and more, and more. Ruckinson stared at the sky in disbelief, as it was quickly blocked from view by the bodies of innumerable combat aircraft of all designations. Men frantically rushed about as they were made ready for battle, but the colonel already knew that to stay and fight would be suicide. With nearly a quarter of his troops already turned into casualties, he had no intention of facing what other nightmares these rebels had in store. No, his mind was made up. They had to fall back and evacuate the city. The whole island, even. As he cleared his throat to sound for the retreat, the words were quickly silenced as his lungs deflated. Looking over the western horizon, he realized that avoiding a battle was not an option, as dozens of figures formed out of the low clouds. "Gunships!" he yelled half-intentionally. As if his warning were their cue, thousands of voices suddenly burst from the hills, filling the atmosphere with cries for victory, vengeance, and retribution. Within seconds, the entire horizon was covered with enemy forces. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, accompanied by thousands of armored vehicles and tanks. "Fall back!" the colonel shouted. "Staggered retreat! Armor, cover the infantry, and watch the skies!" And yet, even as he said it, he knew that a battle was inevitable. No, not a battle, he thought. There will be no glory in this. This will be a massacre. He had just finished his thoughts when the gunships were upon them. Storms of bullets scythed down infantry in swaths. Rockets and armor-piercing shells reduced armor to flaming wrecks. Rubble, discarded weapons, and bones crunched beneath the treads of tanks and APCs. Ground assault jets strafed the British rear lines. The Republic's spear tip drove a massive wedge into the forces of the British retreat, nearly splitting the enemy in two. The combat helicopters maneuvered among the smoke and fire of anti-air rockets and strafing AA guns, picking them off one by one before moving on to the rest. Republic infantry swarmed through the streets of the ruined city, overwhelming those covering the retreaters with their sheer numbers and massive firepower. Tanks smashed down walls and ripped through scores of enemies with high explosive shells. In the thick of it all, the proud bulk of the Mammoth tank fought, its mighty form embroiled in a sea of bullets and missiles as it mercilessly bludgeoned its way through the heftiest of the defenders' positions. Its commander's hatch was open, and General Patton himself could be seen personally directing the movements of his troops through the chaos of battle, standing with his entire upper body exposed to the gunfire of the enemy. Bullets and grenade shrapnel flew all about him, yet not one connected. As if protected by some invisible force field, the general plowed on atop his super-heavy tank like a god of war, undaunted by the dangers of the battle that engulfed him. Michael McKinley stood in awe of the sight for the briefest moment, taking in as much of the general's martial prowess as he could before moving on to keep up with his platoon. The Republic Marines' 2nd and 5th Battalions made up the bulk of the spear tip, and only now did the Chancellor's son truly appreciate the honor of being led by such an inspiring figure. The best part about it to Michael was that his older brother, who was in the Army Corps of Engineers, had designed the M750 Mammoth tank. It filled him with pride to see General Patton using the first ever deployed of his brother's pride and joy. He could still remember the old computer strategy game that inevitably gave his brother the idea. "McKinley, keep in formation!" a harsh voice cried over the din of explosions and gunfire. Michael tore his eyes from the spectacle and returned his focus to the task at hand. His platoon was to join up with 3 others from the 5th and drive the enemy out of the residential district. From there they would push until they had secured the courthouse. "Yes, sir!" he shouted back, catching up with the rest of his fellow Marines within seconds. The resistance was much less severe on the northern side of the city, the bulk of the enemy having moved to the industrial sector further south. The platoon had just finished clearing out the basement of a downed apartment building when the sergeant tapped his radio earpiece, closing his other ear with his hand to better hear what was being said. "Roger that, Captain. We'll be there in no time." He turned to his troops around him. "New orders from the general. We round our course and push south until we hit the coast. Now let's move out." The men were quick to ascend the concrete stairs that led back out to the surface. The enemy were evidently intending to retreat back to the beachhead upon which they had initially landed, and it was their job to make sure that that didn't happen. As they swept through the ruins of Kulisuk's residential areas, they linked up with more and more platoons of Marines, until finally all of 5th Battalion was mercilessly driving south, gunning down any British soldier that didn't throw down his arms and surrender. By providence, their course led them to meeting up with the Republic Army's 3rd Armored Division, and within seconds the vehicles were being mounted by the new, now leg-weary Marines. "This'll cut our time to reach the 2nd in half," shouted a soldier next to McKinley as they clung to the turret of the T-92B that they had jumped aboard. "Maybe we'll be able to get some more action after all." Michael smiled and nodded, but he knew that it was a pointless hope. Yes, they were now moving more than twice as fast, but the follow-up force would head the British off long before they would get there. "This is Colonel Ruckinson to the HMS George VI. Would someone please pick up the damn radio and respond?" He rode in the back of a Jackal 4 armored fighting vehicle, his Challenger having been destroyed in the gunship's initial assault. He had tried to rally his men for an organized retreat, and at first the attempt had proven quite successful, as his forces had fallen back and set up better firing positions, while the injured had been evacuated. The helicopters did significant damage, but his AA defenses had been able to keep them at a fair distance. Then the ground forces had come, headed by a monstrous war engine which Ruckinson hadn't believed possible to construct. They came like a hurricane, the massive tank steamrolling over the front lines like an unstoppable juggernaut. It came surrounded by formations of enemy infantry and armor, and the colonel couldn't believe that he was facing an actual, organized military armed with all modern weapons. There was still no reply from the George VI, as his Jackal crested the hill that descended to the extraction point. He looked out at the scene behind him, and grimaced as what remained of the expedition force retreated in disarray from the ruins of Kulisuk, now burning anew from the natives' counterattack. He still had a hard time believing it. In his almost 2 decades of serving in the military, this was the first time he had been led so blindly into a trap. While they had been given to believe that they were quashing a rebellion on an ice-bound primitive land, they were actually in an all-out war with a modernized industrial nation with a surprisingly powerful military. It was inconceivable that the forces of Great Britain could be fooled so easily. And yet they had been. Crackling over the radio caught the colonel's attention. "Ruckinson, is that you? This is Admiral Roth speaking." "It's me, old friend," he replied, his blood racing through his veins as he heard the explosions from the enemy guns getting closer. "You're alive! Thank goodness! What the devil is going on here? The entire operation is a bloody mess." "You think so?" Ruckinson replied in fury. "It was all a trap. We were meant to take the city, Rolf. They used it as bait, and we took it. Now I need you to get over here and get us off this cursed island before the rest of us are slaughtered." A booming noise resounded, and he was surprised to see that it came from the radio. "That's easier said than done, Colonel," the Admiral replied. "We're having our own handful of problems out at sea. The enemy—" The signal was cut off before Rolf could finish. Ruckinson wanted to shout out after him, but the words caught in his throat. Having their own set of problems, he thought. Oh, hell. Please don't tell me that they were lured into a trap as well. As the thoughts registered in his mind, troopers all around him began shouting and cursing, several pointing to the northwest. The colonel looked to see what the matter was this time, and his blood went cold. An entirely new force of natives came storming over the hillside, just as numerous as the ones that had attacked them initially. While the first assault had been the sword that delivered the slashes designed to cut them down, this was the hammer destined to deliver the finishing blow. Caught between the might of 2 advancing enemy armies, Ruckinson saw no hope for victory or escape. All he could do now was try to save as many of his men's lives as he could. He walked among his troops solemnly, patting several on the shoulder and looking them in the eye. Though he spoke no words, his somber eyes betrayed what he was intending to do. Their reactions were mixed, but he pressed on, eventually coming to the last Challenger intact and mounting it. He stood at his full height, not allowing himself to show any hint of cowardice or dishonor. He removed his helmet and took out a white handkerchief that he had not yet used. "Lay down your arms, men." He didn't shout, But the still air carried his words to every ear present. Lay down your arms. Hesitantly, slowly, the men around him placed their guns on the ground before them, some taking much longer than others. Then, even more reluctantly than when they had dropped their weapons, the British soldiers raised their hands in surrender. As the Republic troops encircled and systematically took custody of the defeated British troops, the imposing figure of the mammoth tank cast its seemingly perpetual shadow over the captured. Patton sat atop the turret, reviewing the battle that had just transpired. It had been a solid one. The British had taken several gunships and a handful of armored vehicles before breaking, as well as inflicting decent casualties among his men. Still, they had been no match for the Republic's attack. Those 90,000 or so that had survived the first Battle of Kulusuk were hopeless against the 200,000 that had assaulted them, not to mention the additional 250,000 that had come mere hours later. They had fought gallantly, but in vain. A transport chopper came over the hillside and landed next to the mammoth, and Patton proceeded to make his way off the vehicle as General Trela emerged. The two strode over to each other and clasped each other's hands. "Well done, George," the Russian said with a smile. "Nice of you to show up, Mikhail," Patton replied. "We really gave them a run for their money." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stick of chewing gum. "Gotta hand it to 'em, though. They fought well." "Indeed. Still, we won. The second battle of Kulusuk is over." Patton nodded, blowing a bubble with his gum nonchalantly and popping it with his teeth. He looked out over the sea. "I wonder how our good friend Admiral Herc is doing."